I just made a couple of microeconomic decisions there. What's the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics? Microeconomics means small. Small economics. Macroeconomics, big economics. What is la diferencia? The difference is that macroeconomics are usually decisions that are made by federal government officials or by federal agencies or by very large businesses. Microeconomic decisions are decisions that are made by individuals such as you and me. So, for example, I chose to have a rather late lunch and drink a mid-afternoon Coke Zero and to eat some ramen noodles, which I was kind of trying to stay on this low-carb diet. So eating ramen noodles, not a good idea for that, but I really felt like some ramen noodles. So anyway. So macroeconomics, big economic decisions, microeconomics, small economic decisions. Now the lesson for today is entitled Government and Macroeconomics. The argument that's presented is this. If we are trying to come up with a good way to answer the question, how much should the government, the federal government in this case, how much should the federal government regulate the economy? A good way of answering that question might be that the government, the federal government, should only work with macroeconomic issues and allow microeconomics to work themselves out among the individual citizenry within the country. It's a pretty nice, clean argument to make in that case. So, what would that mean exactly? Well, what that means exactly is that the federal government should essentially take care of creating maybe trade agreements with other countries, regulating the kinds of things that you're able to ship into this country, the kinds of things that can be shipped out of the country, and then to also oversee maybe some interstate commerce, which would be stuff that's being shipped and moved from one state to the next. And those could be considered macroeconomics, I believe. Now, the interstate thing, I'm not quite sure if that would be macroeconomics, and I'm not quite sure if there's a nice, clean, perfectly clean way of saying that in this case, this is macroeconomics, and in this case, this is microeconomics, except to say that macroeconomics typically is dealing with much bigger economic decisions, like on a national scale or international scale, and microeconomics is dealing with far smaller things like on an individual business scale. So I think it's a pretty nice, clean way to define how much a federal government should be involved. The federal government should be involved in the economy by saying it should pretty much just confine itself to dealing with macro, big economic issues. Okay, so our text today moves on to develop this argument in several different ways. So first off, Adam Smith. Let's talk about Adam Smith. So of course, Adam Smith is the author of The Wealth of Nations, and our text points out that Adam Smith, even before the term macroeconomics had come along, made the argument that the government that governments need to regulate commerce to some degree, but he essentially argued that the economic levels at which government needs to be operating needs to be big overarching stuff, not nitty-gritty little stuff. So Adam Smith is already making this argument back in the book Wealth of Nations, but he isn't using the terms macroeconomics and microeconomics, but he essentially is saying the same thing. Now, Thomas Jefferson essentially believed the same thing as well. Thomas Jefferson was very conservative and was very states' rights oriented, which meant he was always favoring small central government because he wanted the states to remain as powerful as possible. And so Thomas Jefferson argued that the federal government should regulate very, very little of the economy, which is very interesting because he then went ahead and bought half of the country, right? He bought the Louisiana Purchase, which was a massive, massive economic decision to make. But we can better understand that if we take economics and we split them into microeconomics and macroeconomics and say, well, Thomas Jefferson was really dealing on a macroeconomic level. And his buying the Louisiana Purchase allowed generations of Americans then to make microeconomic decisions by buying pieces of property throughout the Louisiana Purchase. So it makes more sense understood that way. Now, finally, obviously, we have established by studying the U.S. government in the first half of this year that the federal U.S. government's power has increased tremendously since 1776. So if you remember, for example, the very first government under the Constitution, which was inaugurated or which began in 1789, had about 100 employees. That is very different from today when there are more like, I think it's between 2 and 3 million, or is it between 3 and 4 million? Whatever, many millions of federal employees. And so the federal government's power has obviously increased a tremendous amount, as evidenced by the huge uptick in the number of employees that it takes to administer all the different government programs that we have today. So the U.S. government's power has increased quite a bit. And the argument is that really a good thing or is it a bad thing? So this goes back to our lesson from yesterday from 10.1 as well, where we were arguing about whether or not the size of government increasing is a good thing or is it or a bad thing. Let me just recap that quick. So the bigger the federal government's the bigger the size of the federal government and its power, the more stable things are going to be, and the less freedom that individuals are going to have. So which one would you rather have, freedom or stability? On the flip side, the smaller the size of the national government, the greater the instability will be, and the greater the amount of freedom that individuals have. And so the American experiment has been trying to figure out how people can both be free and how there can also be as much stability as possible. So with that little review in mind, the federal government's power has increased a lot since 1776, including its regulation of the economy. And so let me just give you one example to show you how exactly this works. So before we get to that, a quick review also of why exactly the federal government is able to regulate the economy. And that is because there is a clause in the Constitution that gives Congress the power to regulate commerce. It's called the Commerce Clause. And it is pretty much talking about commerce that's going to be taking place between the different states and international and other countries. So international trade, and also trade that's going to be taking place between one state and a different state. That's called interstate commerce. So interstate commerce and international commerce. Now, since the Civil War, the United States government has used its power to push forward a civil rights agenda. And so, as I've mentioned before, I agree with almost everything that the U.S. government has pushed for over the last 150 years. And for example, I'm mostly here talking about the civil rights issues dealing with freeing or with allowing black people and other minority groups to have as much power and as much freedom as white people within the country. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking in this case about Roe v. Wade and giving women access to abortions. That's something I do not support at all. But in this case, I'm talking about giving black people and other minority groups as much freedom as white people have. Now, the United States has flexed its powers to be able to push forward that agenda, but that actually crisscrosses with this Commerce Clause. And so let me show you how exactly that works. So the United States government, Congress specifically, has the power to regulate interstate commerce. So up until like the 1960s, in the South, there were places where white people were allowed into certain restaurants or certain businesses, and Congress was able to use the Commerce Clause to tell businesses that they were not allowed to do that they were not allowed to serve only white people and not black people. Now, how exactly would that work? How could Congress flex its power and use the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, which is supposed to be dealing with the economy? How could they use that power to actually force people to follow certain civil rights? Well, the way they did that is this. Let me just give you kind of a really broadly painted story, because I was looking for this particular story. I couldn't find it, so I'm just going to have to tell you the best that I can from my memory. But there was I believe a restaurant in Florida, maybe Alabama or Georgia, somewhere in the deep South, that was refusing to provide food or fuel or whatever good that they were selling to black people. And the federal government, I'm pretty certain it was a restaurant. Yes, it was a restaurant. The federal government reached in there and told that specific restaurant that because of their ability to regulate commerce, they were going to be forced to serve black people. Okay, so how did that work? Well, the federal government said this: look, you are serving food that's coming from different states. You've got napkins, you've got other containers, you've got all kinds of stuff coming from all over the place, because not everything that you are using and serving within your restaurant is coming from your specific state. It means we get to regulate whatever happens inside those doors. And so since you are running an establishment that's based on interstate commerce, and the Constitution gives us the power to regulate that, we can tell you who is allowed to be in your store, or we're allowed to tell you who you cannot. Do you know where I'm going here? We can tell you who you have to serve. How's that? There we go. And so that's how the Commerce Clause was used to force that particular restaurant to serve black people. Now, does that mean that the federal government went around to every single restaurant and told every single restaurant that was not serving black people that they have to serve black people because of the Commerce Clause? No, of course not. They used that one restaurant to set up a precedent, and then were able to use that precedent moving forward to force all restaurants to integrate and to serve both white and black people and other minority groups as well. So that's one way in which the Commerce Clause has been used to push forward a civil rights agenda. So just like I said before, I totally agree with that. That's baloney that you would choose to not serve black people. Come on. That's extremely racist. So I agree with that, but do I agree with the federal government flexing its powers that were not intended to be used in that way in the Constitution to push forward civil rights, a civil rights agenda? Not quite so sure about that. Okay. One of the questions that we have here in your book of texts, your textbook, is this. Number 2, can you think of any specific macroeconomic decisions that have affected your own family? That's the last thing I want to discuss here. Great question. And I'm looking forward to seeing what your answers are to this question. And unfortunately, by the time you see this video, you will have answered this question already, or maybe fortunately, whatever. But here is a little bit of discussion on that. So once again, macroeconomics, big economy; microeconomics, small economy. So you and your family are busy making microeconomic decisions, right? Small economic decisions, just little ones. You start a business, you buy Coke Zero, you eat ramen noodles, whatever. Those are all microeconomic decisions. And so big overarching macroeconomic decisions are being made by people far away from you and your family in New York City or in Washington, D.C. or whatever. And so they seem like those decisions seem far away, right? But how have decisions that have been made by people far away actually filtered down to influence you? Well, I've got one example. It's the reason actually that I've got this Coke Zero here. Why the ramen noodles? Did I show you the ramen noodles before? I actually don't remember. I took a couple of did a couple of takes of this video, and I couldn't remember if I actually showed these to you before. Whatever. Got ramen noodles. So why the Coke Zero and the ramen noodles? Well, the reason I wanted to show you the Coke Zero is that I just read a news article that said that because of some of the government regulations that are resulting from COVID-19, we may have a hard time getting access to CO2, which is infused into a drink like Coke Zero to make it fizzy. And we may end up having non-fizzy drinks coming up here soon. Now, I highly doubt they're going to be releasing non-fizzy Coke Zero, but that might be an issue moving ahead here. I hope not, because I really enjoy fizzy drinks. I must have fizzy drinks. I love fizzy drinks. And so I really hope that they get this thing figured out. But that would be an example of a macroeconomic decision where a government says no more CO2 because it's coming from an unsafe place or whatever. I don't know what the exact decision is, but that would be a macroeconomic decision that is now influencing me. Another good example of a macroeconomic decision influencing you is the trade war that the United States fought with China over the last couple of years. Now, that has mostly been resolved, and I'm very curious to see how this is going to resume, how the economic relationship between the United States and China will resume once once this whole COVID-19 thing is blown over, because right now, the discussion surrounding China's role in the spread of COVID-19 is a little suspicious. I'm going to have to see how that is going to then play out once things get back to some sort of sense of normalcy. But before the trade deals that Trump and Xi Jinping, the leader of China, struck earlier this year, before that, the United States and China actually were at war, trade-wise, at war with each other. And that actually had a pretty significant influence on you without you knowing it, because there are a lot of products that are actually made by the Chinese that you use on a daily basis, such as light bulbs. And so there's a good chance that your family paid a lot more, maybe paid more for light bulbs or some other good that you use because of this trade war that was going on. Now, I know actually of a more specific example in Ohio, because there's a lot of cabinet shops and furniture shops in Ohio, and the price of plywood went up quite a bit as a result of the trade wars, because there were different Chinese companies that were actually making plywood, and wood products were some of the goods that were being taxed at a high level as part of the trade war with China. And so that raised the price of plywood, and so there were lots of furniture makers that were scrambling to find other ways to get plywood. So I know in one case, one of my friends, his name is Michael. Michael and his dad own a cabinet shop, and what they ended up doing, I believe, is that the company from China didn't send its plywood directly from China to the United States. Instead, it sent its plywood to some other country, and then that country actually sent it to the United States, and so they were able to avoid the tariff in the United States entirely, because it wasn't being shipped from China; it was being shipped from a different country entirely. So I found that kind of funny. But anyway, so that would be another example of how a big overarching macroeconomic decision that's being made by Donald Trump is actually filtering itself all the way down to Amish country, Ohio, right? Okay, so that's going to do it for today. Your assignment for today is going to be to read 10.3. Read and do 10.3. Let's recap. How much should a government be involved in economics? A good way of defining how much a federal government should be involved in the nation's economy is to say that the federal government should hold itself to only dealing with macroeconomic issues and allow individuals and businesses to make microeconomic decisions largely untouched. Mr. Chris, out. Hope you all enjoy a wonderful afternoon, and what could really make it better would be a good slurp of Coke Zero. Have a good one.